the fifth installment of my History.Swiftly, Swift Production virtual field trip. We're going to celebrate Black History Month with a famous artist here in Westchester. Now, Chester County is certainly known for its artists. You know, some of the most famous being Andrew Wyeth, his son Jamie Wyeth, his father N.C. Wyeth, the Howard Pyle Brandywine School of Art. Well, there was an African-American artist that lived right here in Westchester that was famous and has some of his artwork today at some of the finest galleries all across the United States and even internationally. And his name was Horace Pippin. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Horace Pippin when I splice and edit this movie together. But we're going to start the tour right here where he lived. He was born in Westchester in 1888. He will eventually, as a young boy, his family's going to move to New York. And he's going to live in New York through World War I. He's going to fight in World War I with the Harlem Hellfighters. And he's going to return here in 1920. And this is his house directly behind me. So, Horace Pippin, as I said, born in Westchester, February 22nd, 1888. He lived in Westchester for a couple of years before moving to Goshen, New York. And he would actually grow up in Goshen, New York. At a young age, when he was 15, his mom was able to enter some work of his into a local little art contest, and he won some crayons and art supplies to kind of feed his passion for painting. But during World War I, he enlisted during World War I and fought with a tenacious group known as the Harlem Hellfighters, but he was not able to fight alongside other American troops because of the segregation within the United States Army. The Army would be segregated all the way through World War II, and it wasn't until Harry Truman during the Korean War that the Army was desegregated. But he fought alongside French soldiers, and in 1918 he was actually injured. He was hit with a sniper's bullet in his right arm, and he lost temporary use of his right arm. Eventually he would regain some mobility of his right arm, but never full mobility of his right arm, and he would have to prop it up when he did a lot of his artwork. So after he was hit, and injured, he was and the war was over, he returned back to Westchester in 1920, and eventually he would be honored with the War Cross from the French Army, the Croix de Guerre, and a Purple Heart from the United States Army for his injury during the war. And when he returned to Westchester, he started to pick up art, and he eventually would say that it was the war that brought the art out of him. But he wasn't well known. So it would not be until 1937 was he sort of discovered. And he was discovered by an incredibly well-known illustrator from Chester County, and his name was N.C. Wyeth. N.C. Wyeth was part of the Brandywine River School of Art, and he discovered some of his artwork. And N.C. Wyeth was judging an art show. He saw some of Pippin's work, and then kind of tried to get some local press for Horace Pippin. Wyeth persuaded the art critic and art curator Christian Britton, another local Chester County resident, to arrange to have Horace Pippin to have his own art show at the Westchester Community Center. And he had 10 oils and 7 burnt wood panels. He would actually take wood panels and burn engravings into it, and then would paint in the wood gravings. And it was that launched his career. And he would become, this was a short time period, 1937 when he was sort of discovered, through his death, 1946. His rise was brilliant. It was astronomical. It was short-lived, though, because he passed away in 1946 when he had a stroke. How is he described? This is the importance of Horace Pippin in the 20th century. It's Depression-era painting, and I'll go on to describe sort of his painting in a minute or two. But this is how important he was described. In his eulogy, an obituary for him in the New York Times, he was eulogized as being the most important African-American painter to have ever appeared in America. Albert Barnes, another local art critic, a cantankerous person, wrote an essay for a catalog kind of accompanying some of Horace Pippin's work in a one-man show in Philadelphia, said that he was the first important African-American painter to ever appear on the American scene. Some of his artwork in his lifetime would go from, the Westchester Community Center to have their own shows at Philadelphia, Chicago, New York. He would be the first African American to have his solo show at the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. San Francisco had art shows featuring Horace Pippin. So his work is well known. His work today sells for well over $1 million. It's highly collectible, and there's not much of it because he was not a prolific artist. Because his after the war, and it was only about a 25-year period that he actually painted. So let's look at some of the work that inspired him to continue to paint when he was convalescing back at home in Westchester, and that was the war itself. That brought some of the passion for art out of him. And we're going to look at some of his work, but probably his most important work during that is this one from 1930, and it is called End of the War, Starting Home, 1930. And if you take a look at it here, you're going to see some brown uniforms, soldiers wearing brown uniforms, bearing bayonets. African American soldiers advance on, you can see them there. The German soldiers wearing kind of their gray uniforms, who appear to be startled, and some are surrendering, some are hiding, some are running. You can see planes overhead, French and German fighter planes skirmishing in the distance, bombs exploding, along the horizon. You can see there's at least one American who has fallen during all of this. And then you can also take a look at the frame itself. This is interesting and pretty rare for Horace Pippin, right? So he affixed small carved versions of sort of the materials of war, whether they're tanks or guns or hand grenades, gas masks during World War I, right? And other tools that would have been used during World War I that he has kind of arranged on the frame itself, alluding to some of the technological advancements during the war that made it even more brutal than any war prior to that. So this is one of his more famous paintings. This is in the Philadelphia Art Museum. Horace Pippin was an astute observer of the world, and his artwork sort of depicts that. And there's always sort of like a backdrop within his work, kind of a theme of peace and social justice in a lot of his artwork. And as I'm talking here, I'm going to put artwork on that deals with sort of the African American community during the Depression and the Depression era. And it was a sort of a view that was invisible to the white masses during this time period before the Great Migration. So it offers us sort of a privileged view behind the curtains as to how African Americans lived during this early 20th century. And it's interesting to see how he depicts African American life. Common folks like the domino players, or people just singing on street corners. To his one of his most famous works, and that is Marian Anderson. And he painted this shortly after she sang on Easter Day on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, arranged by Eleanor Roosevelt. So some of this work here shows the behind the scenes, what it was like living in African American communities in the early 20th century. Okay, here's obviously an image that you guys should be very familiar with, the Westchester Courthouse, which he included in a painting in 1940 called, well, Westchester Courthouse. Not much has changed, as you can see from here to the painting, which I'll show you. When he did paint it in 1940, there would have been tram lines running through Westchester, or electrical lines for a tram that went through Westchester. He chose to exclude those wires in the tram line. The building to the right, the old annex building to the right of the courthouse, would not have been there at the time. And there would have been a tree to the right of the Civil War veteran here. That has long since been removed. But otherwise it looks pretty close to the way that it did in Horace Pippin's time in 1940. So here I am at Everhart Park. And this was actually the site of Horace Pippin's last painting. Everhart Park, which is in the, let me think here, southwest quadrant of Westchester, was originally owned by the Everhart family, and it became a communal gathering space, a park, in 1905 when the land was donated to Westchester. But the Everhart family always kind of used the space for public gatherings, for religious and abolitionist gatherings. So as I walk here through Everhard Park here, you'll see off a little bit in the distance a red bench. And that red bench was donated by the Friends of Everhard Park to the life of Horace Pippin. And it was meant to replicate a red bench that he used in a painting of Everhard Park. There were never red benches actually in Everhard Park. As we can look around here, the benches in here are your typical, just wood grain bench. But there's one here that is representative of the painting that Horace Pippin did, possibly of himself. Some people say it was a self-portrait of him just kind of relaxing just before his death in 1946 on a red bench on a fall day, and with the trees around him and the fall colors. So here is that red bench for Horace Pippin and the life of Horace Pippin here in Everhard Park. I know it's a little cold for ice cream, but I have to. So we tried this new place that was the old Westchester Bar, but it's Scoops and Smiles now. So, and I forgot, I don't know where my selfie stick is. I've misplaced my selfie stick, so we're having to do this by hand now. So if it's a little bit herky-jerky, sorry. Okay, off to the next stop. Got my ice cream. So this is the Birmingham Quaker Meeting House, and it was built in 1763. They have been worshiping on this site, Quakers, since 1690. And Horace Pippin used this meeting house on a number of occasions in his paintings. The cemetery, or the burial ground just behind it, has both Revolutionary War soldiers from the British and the American side that passed away during the Battle of the Brandywine in 1777. And this meeting house was used as a hospital after the Battle of Brandywine in 1777. So I'll show you a couple of paintings of this meeting house that Horace Pippin used. So just a quick look around here, and then we'll move on to the next site. Okay, so I'm sure I'm going to use this as a possible question if we do this live. What is this in front of me here? It's got, looks like 3 blocks up. Good. So here's the burial ground behind the Birmingham Quaker Meeting House. And then you can see off in a distance, and I'll zoom in on it a little bit, an octagonal building there. And that actually was an old schoolhouse that would have been used in the 19th century here at the Quaker Meeting House. So as I said, Horace Pippin, a lot of his work kind of targets peace and social justice. Whether it was paintings that depict a prior time, mid-19th century, a slave being whipped, or slaves living on a cotton plantation. But one of the more interesting paintings that I think that he did that I find particularly powerful is called Mr. Prejudice. And in Mr. Prejudice here, it was painted during World War II. It was painted in the midst of World War II in the 1940s. And it's unique because it splits the painting between 2 different races. So if you take a look at it here, you're going to see, as you look at it, in the lower left, right, you can see in the lower left a quadrant that is filled with African American military, a medic, a machinist. They're all facing forward towards us, right? So we're looking at them and they're engaging with us, the viewer. You're also going to see in the center left a World War II uniformed African American, perhaps a self-portrait of Horace Pippin. And then on the right hand, you're going to see a similar group, but they're white men, who fill the lower right quadrant, and they're turned towards the left. So you'll see in there a group of white men, and it's dominated by a white man with a sledgehammer who's driving a wedge into a large V. Now, the V campaign was, V stood for victory during World War II, but African Americans had a campaign known as Double V. Victory during World War II, but victory at home to end racism. And you can see that white man with a sledgehammer splitting that double V. In the upper left, you see a Statue of Liberty, a darker complected Statue of Liberty who raises her torch towards light, to light the way to freedom. But then in the upper right-hand corner, you see a large, lighter-skinned figure who is dressed in red, who holds a noose and stares at the Statue of Liberty, while a hooded Ku Klux Klansman looms above him. So a pretty powerful painting here depicting life in the 1940s and segregation and racism that was present here at home in America as people were fighting World War II. But this is known as the Holy Mountain, and it sort of looks a lot like the Peaceable Kingdom that was painted by a Quaker artist named Edward Hicks in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. And bears a striking resemblance to it, but there are some differences. Where Edward Hicks kind of painted quite literally the bucolic scene of Eden, where all creatures sort of existed in perfect harmony, Pippin does not. Pippin tailors the subjects to reflect both his personal experiences and cultural climate of the period. This was 1940s. So you can see a shepherd, an African-American shepherd, and clad in bright white robe, who stands at the center. And he's surrounded by a bunch of children and animals, both real and imaginary, and it's all around a lush landscape. Now, the shepherd actually bears a striking resemblance to Horace Pippin, and some scholars believe that possibly it's a bit of a self-portrait with Pippin there. Now, what Pippin does, if you take a close look at here, is he contrasts kind of the harmonic foreground, right? You know, the bucolic, beautiful foreground. But if you look behind there, there is a threatening, ominous background where soldiers lurk. You can see soldiers lurking in the background in the forest, adjacent to a military burial ground. And as you look at this here, I can tell you that it was painted on June 6, 1944. And again, this is a reflection of that time period. What happened on June 6, 1944? D-Day during World War II. So what we're going to look at here are some historical works by Horace Pippin. And they focus on two subjects that were very important in the middle of the 19th century who fought for the rights of African Americans and slaves. One was, of course, Abraham Lincoln, and the other is John Brown. And let's talk about the Abraham Lincoln ones first. So Abraham Lincoln was the focus of a book by a well-known early 20th century author, Carl Sandburg. And it's probably some of Carl Sandburg's stories in his books about Abraham Lincoln that was the inspiration for Horace Pippin's painting. So this first painting that we're going to look at is Abraham Lincoln and his father building a log cabin along Pigeon Creek. This is in Indiana. So this was a pivotal moment in Abraham Lincoln's life. It shows him as a young adolescent working next to his father in front of a half-composed log cabin as they're chopping down wood and logs from the stumps of fallen trees to be able to make this log cabin. The second painting here is Abraham Lincoln's first book. And again, this was a story that was told in the Carl Sandburg anthology on Abraham Lincoln. And it sort of reinforces that image of Abraham Lincoln as a self-taught learner, a self-taught genius, a voracious reader. And if you take a look at the painting here, this painting shows Abraham Lincoln as a source of light in a relatively dark world. It has a little bit of a play on darkness and light. In the dark painting, you see Abraham Lincoln sort of radiating more light in his attic bedroom than that little tiny candle could possibly emit next to his bed. Sort of half reclined among storage barrels and sacks, Lincoln is reaching up for his first book, probably the Bible. There are a couple of sources that Abraham Lincoln probably attributed more than any others to sort of his style for writing and for reading and speaking. And even though he was not an overtly religious man, the Bible was one. The other was William Shakespeare. So here you have Abraham Lincoln reaching for that first book, possibly a Bible. Another painting is The Good Samaritan, and this is where Horace Pippin paints a winter scene of Abraham Lincoln, now kind of a young man but of imposing size, walking through heavy snow, and he's offering help to a young boy who's chopping away wood from a fallen tree with just a hatchet. So this is kind of the kinder side of Abraham Lincoln. And then the final painting is known as Abraham Lincoln, Abe Lincoln, the Great Emancipator. And in this painting, you've got Abraham Lincoln as president, emancipating, freeing a sentry, a soldier who had fallen asleep during night watch. And in those days, I mean, that could have been an offense in which he could have been hanged or sent to the firing squad. And here is Abraham Lincoln, who is sort of forgiving him of that. And you've got General Ulysses S. Grant sort of in a bemused way looking with two armed guards next to Lincoln, looking at Lincoln there as Lincoln puts his hand over the shoulder of the kneeling sentry. This painting has also been known as Abraham Lincoln, the Great Emancipator, Pardons the Sentry. And again, it's Pippin who is drawn to that Christian humanity of Abraham Lincoln. He portrays that moment where Lincoln has saved the life of a man scheduled to die probably before a firing squad. So this is that other work of Horace Pippin on Abraham Lincoln. So these next three paintings deal with the subject of John Brown. Horace Pippin painting John Brown, and these are some of his more famous works. John Brown was a 19th century abolitionist that is most famous and most well known for his hacking to death of pro-slavery forces and men along the Potawatomi Creek in Kansas, and his raid at Harper's Ferry. It would have been Virginia in 1859. Today it's West Virginia, but West Virginia wasn't a state until 1863. So at Harper's Ferry, total failure. Pretty much everything John Brown does in life is a total failure. But John Brown is regarded as an incredibly important person in American history. He'll be caught at Harper's Ferry, he'll be tried, he'll be hanged. And Horace Pippin depicts his trial and his hanging in his paintings. So it was a total failure. But he's probably, with Abraham Lincoln, two of the more important people who brought about the Civil War. And he was looked at the time of his death as sort of an American hero. In the North, not in the South, in the North, because he was willing to give his life to help free the slaves. Frederick Douglass said, about himself, he said, "I can live for the slave." John Brown was willing to die for the slave. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great transcendentalist, gushed that John Brown had made the gallows as glorious as Christ did the cross. But in the 20th century, early 20th century, John Brown was looked at by a lot of white historians as somebody that was not just fanatical, but somebody that was completely out of touch and maybe crazy, as no sane man would be willing to give their life to the cause that doesn't necessarily impact them. And the cause, of course, was slavery. John Brown was a staunch abolitionist. Now, I'll tell you that in the late 20th, early 20th century, there has been sort of a new history, a new way of looking at, new scholarship on John Brown. And he's looked at by most historians as somebody that maybe had been fanatical, but he was just passionate for his cause. And the cause that he was fighting against was the worst in American history, slavery. And he was willing to give his life to bring an end to that. It wasn't a success, but maybe long-term it was through the Civil War. So actually, just a few months ago in the fall, Ethan Hawke put together a miniseries on Showtime, Good Lord Bird. Absolutely fantastic. All about John Brown. It's a bit of a historical fictional account. They certainly take some liberties with John Brown, but it's absolutely fantastic. And of course it ends at his hanging in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So Horace Pippin depicts kind of a more inward looking, an intimate, a more vulnerable, a more passive John Brown, rather than John Brown, who was a preeminent man of action. He was a man of action, not necessarily words. African Americans have always looked at John Brown and held him in a certain level of esteem because of the way that he fought on behalf of slaves and African Americans. And Horace Pippin depicts him interestingly in these paintings. So we're going to look at three paintings of him. And again, it shows a more intimate, a more vulnerable, a more passive John Brown than that John Brown of action. So this first painting here is John Brown in his Bible. You see a grimly determined face on John Brown. He hasn't grown his long signature beard at this point. It's a younger John Brown. His face, his white shirt seem to give off a considerable amount of light, more light than that little candle that's placed near John Brown's right hand that's on the table. The scene takes place at night, and if you look through the window in the left background, you see that it's dark outside. It's pitch black outside. The half-drawn curtain, the checked curtain, is quite bright. And it's Pippin's treatment of Brown here, like Lincoln reading the Bible, in which Brown is able to generate sort of his own light from this. He has his own interior moral light that is exuding from him, sort of like that painting of Abraham Lincoln. In the second painting is the Trial of John Brown. And this is an interesting painting. It's a curious painting. John Brown in this painting sort of lies wounded on the floor of that Virginia courtroom. You can't even figure out which one John Brown is, except for, you can tell that it is him because he's got a kind of like a blanket that's over him. He's darkened by a blanket. His light is put out. But if it weren't for his wound and that little Bible next to him and maybe the blanket thrown over him, it would be difficult to determine which one is John Brown, partly because Horace Pippin has painted all 14 men in his composition with virtually identical faces. It's like a little bit of a visual pun on the phrase jury of one's peers. So Pippin is maybe suggesting here that John Brown was not really any different from any other American, except for that for whatever reason, John Brown acted upon what was best in the Bible, the best in American traditions, and the best for America, and that was, of course, trying to end slavery. Now, this last painting is a fantastic painting. I mean, it is just such an interesting painting when you look at it and you think about it here. Here is John Brown going to his hanging. He is a prisoner at the end of his life being led to the gallows on a cart drawn by 2 white horses. It's all outside. The action is outside. There's 2 bare oak trees which frame either side of John Brown, reminding us that it's a winter scene. And winter scenes oftentimes reflect death. The most extraordinary, the really interesting part of this composition is the foreground, what's in the front. There's a crowd that's been gathered to watch John Brown's execution. But in order to watch John Brown, they've turned their backs to us, the viewers, right? So Pippin has forced the viewers, us, to really become part of that crowd that cheered on John Brown's death. And he's asking us, he's forcing us really, to choose sides. Are we simply observers to the event like the rest of the assembled crowd, or would we have objected? Would we have objected the hanging of John Brown, that martyr trying to end slavery? Pippin heightens this immediacy with choosing by including a small African-American figure in the lower right-hand corner. Now, according to the Pippin's family tradition, Pippin's grandmother had been present at Harper's Ferry, Virginia for John Brown's execution. She is most possibly here that little African-American figure in this painting. And Pippin has drawn that personal connection between his family and himself and the event. And if you take a look at her, unlike the other figures in the painting, she faces the viewer squarely with a scowl on her face as she's sort of rebuking the action in the painting. It's an interesting painting here if you look at it. Now, this is what I love about these paintings, especially the ones with Abraham Lincoln and Horace Pippin, is that Horace Pippin is demanding us, his audience, to take lessons from our history and to take those lessons seriously. He reminds us that the issues of peace and freedom and racial justice embodied in those 2 19th century figures, those 2 2 white men, Abraham Lincoln and John Brown, are still relevant. They were relevant in the middle of the 19th century. They were relevant when Horace Pippin painted these in the 30s and 40s. They are still relevant today, and absolutely relevant today in the 21st century when we continue to talk about peace and freedom and racial justice in America. So, as I usually do, I include a cemetery as part of my tour here. And this is our final stop, and this is the grave site of Horace Pippin. So he died in 1946. He suffered from a stroke and passed away. And he's buried just outside of Westchester, off of Route 100 in the Chestnut Grove Annex Cemetery. This is where a lot of African Americans were buried when they were denied burial in the Chestnut Grove Cemetery. So I'm going to flip the screen here, and I'll show you his final resting place. So the final resting place of Horace Pippin Born in 1888, passed away in 1946, and is honored with the American flag next to his grave, as he was a veteran of World War I. So this is going to conclude field trip number 5, the first one of the third marking period. I'll try to do another one in the third marking period, and we'll do a couple more in the fourth marking period. Maybe we'll be able to do one in person. I guess wishful thinking. So thank you for joining me, and we'll put something together soon. Take care.